Many news organizations, including this one, spent at least part of today chasing a new report in The Guardian that, if true, would be of significant interest to Mueller's investigators in the Russian collusion investigation. From that report, quote, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, held secret talks with Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London and visited around the time he joined Trump's campaign, The Guardian has been told. Sources have said Manafort went to see Assange in 2013, 15, and in the spring of 16, during the period when he was made a key figure in Trump's push for the White House. Months later, WikiLeaks released a stash of Democratic emails stolen by Russian intelligence officers. Manafort, Assange, and WikiLeaks all deny that any meetings took place, and NBC News has not confirmed The Guardian's story. But the report follows a line of questioning that's been central to Mueller's investigation since the beginning. What did members of the Trump campaign know about the Russian hack of Hillary Clinton's emails, and when did they know it? Joining us at the table, Elise Jordan, former aide in the George W. Bush White House and State Department, now an MSNBC analyst. Matt, Frank, and Tim are all still here. Frank, let me start with you. This seems like the line of questioning that reinforces what Devlin just said about where this investigation is pointing toward now.
Yep, Nicole, I've long said on your show that Manafort is the vector by which the campaign caught the Russian infection. And if the reporting from The Guardian is accurate, then Mueller has this already, and Mueller is now closing that loop between the Russia connection, the Russian government, the Trump campaign, and WikiLeaks. And if you close that loop, you've got your collusion case developed. The question is this what Manafort is willing to die in prison for? Is he really holding back on the fact that he was that go-between between the Russians and Julian Assange regarding the release of the hacked emails? If that's true, we've got the collusion case. We just need to wait and see and wait for the filing, the next filing for Mueller, to tell us why he knows Manafort is lying to him, and have him lay that out for us publicly.
Matt Miller, I want to play for you something Jeremy Bash said on the show. It's possible you were here this day, too. Let's watch it and talk about it on the other side.
It's possible that Russia actually sent and dispatched Paul Manafort to the Trump campaign, or at least that once Paul Manafort attached himself to the Trump campaign, the Russians said, okay, our agent is now on the inside, and that they tried to manipulate the campaign, not just through propaganda, not just through Russia Today, but also through agents of influence. And I think ultimately when it comes down to it,
wait. So are you saying it's possible that they're going to want to find out if Manafort was a Russian plant? Is that one of the questions the investigation is going to try to answer?
Absolutely. They're going to want it. They're going to want to know whether or not there were ties between Paul Manafort and Russia, whether they were financial or otherwise, that caused him to, in effect, do Russia's bidding. And whether wittingly or unwittingly, in the same situation that Mike Flynn found himself in, whether he was doing work on behalf of the Russian Federation inside the Trump campaign. And then the ultimate question, Nicole, is whether or not Trump himself knew about it.
So the other title for that piece is The Day Jeremy Bash Blew My Mind. But if you could just pick up the thread of whether this, you would agree that this is a line of questioning that of course we don't hear much about. But what strikes me and what endures about that sound is that Jeremy Bash, as a former chief of staff at the CIA and having served years on the intel committees, used the same language that John Brennan used when he testified about the extent and the nature of Russian meddling, that either wittingly or unwittingly people were involved in the Russian effort. That sound seems to endure, and it seems to be at the center of some of the questions Mueller may be trying to answer. Matt Miller.
Yeah, I think Jeremy made a great point that day, and you don't even have to take his worst-case scenario that Manafort was sent by the Russians. There's a scenario that's not quite that extreme where Manafort got there on his own, but then once he was there, decided to use his position in the Trump campaign, as a bridge with the Russians and with the Russian connections that he had, Russian oligarchs and members of the Russian intelligence service, who we know he was communicating with while he was on the Trump campaign. We don't yet know the substance of all of those communications, but we know it's been public that he's been communicating with his former associate, who is a member of Russian intelligence, while he was running the campaign. So I think if this report in The Guardian is true, and I'm a little skeptical of it just because there are so many people inside the U.S. government that will have been monitoring the comings and goings of that embassy, and I would be a bit surprised if it hadn't leaked out at this point, this being 2 years after the fact. But if it's true, I think what it does is it reduces the number of dots you have to connect. We've always wondered, is the communication from, Julian Assange to Roger Stone to the campaign, or is it from Assange to Corsi to Stone to the campaign? This would shrink that number of dots and make it just directly from WikiLeaks to the campaign itself in the form of the campaign chairman.
It also re-upped some of the questions about, I mean, Donald Trump, he tweeted this week something about hundreds of people who can attest to never talking to Russians, something no one on a campaign has ever said. I can attest to that. But it was a small circle. So Paul Manafort wouldn't have had these contacts without the president's people closest to him knowing about it. And if you just take the members or the participants of the Trump Tower meeting, and you have to assume that some of these things went down, well, who's around? Well, Jared was around. Don Jr. was around. Paul Manafort was around. You sort of have the same universe of individuals who were in that Trump Tower meeting where they willingly and gleefully went to get dirt on Hillary Clinton from Russians, now under scrutiny for potential contacts with Assange.
Well, and also, as you've pointed out, they were at the RNC convention,
right,
too.
Changing the platform for the first time in
Ambassador
history.
Kislyak, you've got KK, Konstantin Kilimnik. Right. You've got Paul Manafort's right-hand man who's been indicted. You have all of these various players who are interacting with the top levels of the Republican National Committee.
It's so bizarre. I've been to all the Republican conventions, and I was usually working on speeches and loading teleprompters, never rubbing shoulders with Russians.
And remember what got changed at the convention.
Right.
It was U.S. policy toward Ukraine, which had been front of mind for Vladimir Putin. Paul Manafort had done work for years prior to the presidential campaign in Ukraine on behalf of Kremlin-friendly regimes. He meets with Assange in 2013 and 2015, prior to his work on the campaign, presumably in association with the work he was doing in Ukraine. Then he meets with Assange sometime in the spring, early summer of 2016. Months later, you get the WikiLeaks drop that Roger Stone knew was coming, Rudy Giuliani seemed to know was coming, the president seemed to know was coming. So the chronology of this doesn't look good for Paul Manafort or the sort of Trump universe being apart from Russia. I think there's some things to consider in how Manafort got in there. I don't know that I buy the idea that the Russians dropped him in. The story they've had out there is that Trump's, campaign kind of unofficial advisor Tom Barrack was the person who introduced Manafort to the campaign. When Don Trump Jr. met in Trump Tower with the Russian emissaries that had Kompromat, it was through Rob Goldstone, this music producer, allegedly. Now, Mueller knows more than all we do, but there's some little kinks in this scenario. But as you mentioned earlier, I think all of these people were in the same place at more or less the same time, and certainly Manafort, Kushner, and Don Trump Jr. were at a Trump Tower meeting in which Kompromat was discussed.
Frank, I want you to pick up on all of this, but I'm going to give you a two-parter here. Mike Flynn is also someone we don't talk about enough, but we know that he was in contact with Ambassador Kislyak, at least on that day of the inauguration. That's been widely reported, and he lied about those contacts, and he could also perhaps, I assume, be providing some context or some information. But I want to read you Mueller's questions about some of these topics and some of these characters. This is, as reported by the New York Times, these are questions that were shared with Trump's lawyers. Mueller wants to know what knowledge the president had of any outreach by his campaign, including by Paul Manafort, to Russia about potential assistance to the campaign. Mueller also wants to know what the president knew about communications between Roger Stone, his associates, Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks.
Yeah, so Mueller is focused like a laser on just what we've been talking about, putting those three puzzle pieces together. Russian government, Trump campaign, WikiLeaks, who knew what when. And if you put those together, you've got a criminal conspiracy that violates numerous laws. Now, I have to assume that the Trump team responded in the negative. We know nothing. We don't know anything about this. You know, we even have Sarah Huckabee Sanders perhaps changing slightly her semantics today or recently, that we were not a part, the president was not a part of any collusion, not necessarily that there was no collusion. So
they always move the goalposts.
It's a big difference because
if it was there, we didn't know about it.
But I think this is what we're going to see. This is
keep going.
This is the defense we're going to see, is that I surrounded myself with bad people, right? We've already heard the president say, Manafort didn't work for me for a very long time. So that distancing has already started long ago. That's what we're going to see as a defense. The question is, when Manafort, Stone, Corsi realize they've got no hope or little hope, and Mueller's got the answers to the questions, when will they flip? And in my experience, as has been talked about in the earlier block, when you're dealing with longtime corrupt people who are con men, still trying to effect that last con, now on the prosecutive team, they have to go to prison and sit there for a while until they realize they've got to cooperate. I think that's what's going to eventually happen here.
All right, well, you'll be here to talk us through it. Matt Miller and Frank Figliuzzi, thank you both so much.